If you're overlooking up the documentation each time you need to generate a name for an Azure resource, or if you've got people around you that bother you and they're like, hey, what should I name this resource or that resource, or how does our naming convention work? Then this is the video for you. Hi there, my name is Matt Orford, and in this video today, I'd like to talk to you about the Azure Naming Tool, what it is, why you should care about it, and we'll also jump into a demo environment where I'll walk you through the installation and configuration of the tool and show you how to generate some resource names using the Azure Naming Tool. So let's get stuck into it. So on the agenda here, I do have a few slides to go to, but I promise not too many. The main focus for today will be jumping into that demo environment and me walking you through how to install and configure the tool. But first off, we'll start off with talking through why naming is important. And from there, that'll then feed into what the Azure Naming Tool actually is and why you should care about it. We'll then jump into the demo environment and go through the installation and configuration of the tool, and I'll show you all of the different things that you're able to do with it. And then we'll go and generate some resource names. First off, using the user interface of the tool, but then we'll jump into the API and I'll show you really briefly how to generate a name using the API as well. And the really good use case there for the API is if you've got other tools or systems or CMDBs that you want to reach out into this Azure Naming Tool for to generate the name and then get a response back, that is a fantastic use case. And we'll also talk about backup and restoration of the configuration of the tool, because after you've gone and tweaked it for your specific company or organization, you're not going to want to lose that configuration. And that will also then feed into how you update the tool as well. Let's kick off though by talking through some of the resource naming considerations. And these are by no means all of the considerations around why you should care about resource naming in Azure. They're just a few key things to be aware of. First off, naming resources in Azure is a core part of the cloud adoption framework published by Microsoft. In fact, if we jump across here into the Edge web browser, I've got the documentation open and we're looking at the cloud adoption framework here, specifically at the best practices down under naming and tagging. And here, it talks through developing your naming and tagging strategy for Azure resources. And specifically under this document called Define Your Naming Convention, as you can see at the top here, it says a good name helps you quickly identify the resource's type, associated workload, environment, and the Azure region hosting it. Now that is great for a number of reasons, but I can also attest to that is really helpful when you're in a troubleshooting scenario and you're trying to piece together different components that are talking to each other, or maybe something's throwing errors in log analytics and you want to quickly identify what that resource type is, where it is, and what function that it's got. That's where a naming convention can really start to help by following the cloud adoption framework here. Next up, there are naming rules and different restrictions for different resources in Azure. So there are some resources that have a minimum character length, like 3 or 6 or 5, and there's some that have a maximum as well. Storage accounts, I think off the top of my head, are 24 characters. Some others that I've seen have 60 characters, so on and so forth. And then there's other things like what delimiter can you use? Sometimes you can use a dash or an underscore. Sometimes, again, like with storage accounts, you can't use any delimiters at all. So there's all these different considerations around different resources, and no one's going to be able to remember these off the top of your head. Next up, changing the name of a resource in Azure is not trivial because it requires deleting that resource and recreating it. There's no option to just go and do a right click and a rename or anything like that. It's not that simple. And some resources, yes, you can just blow them away and recreate them and all well and good. Other resources are not going to be that trivial just to blow away and recreate. So if you can put some thought into your naming convention from day one, it's going to serve you a lot better over the course of time. Lastly here, I write a lot of infrastructure as code, and resource names are used a lot in infrastructure as code. We often pull in other resource names that already exist into our current scope, so we need to know what those resource names are going to be. And often when you reference other resources, you'll do that by using the ID or the name, and the name is a part of the resource ID as well. So being able to have that consistent approach to naming means that you can programmatically generate and then look up some of the names of your other resources in Azure. So with some of the foundations there on why having a good naming standard can help, How do we actually go about doing this? And this is where the Azure Naming Tool can really come in to help you and your organization. So, the Azure Naming Tool is a user interface or an API tool that is used simply to generate names for Azure resources. That is pretty much all it does, but it does it very well. After you go through the installation and configuration process, you define organization components and guardrails with how your specific organization has agreed to name resources in Azure. And you've got a lot of control there around what you can do. After that, names can then be generated by users who can access the tool. So there's an admin login to the tool, which you'll see here in a few moments. And that's where we have the ability to go and modify the configuration and change the settings of the tool. But anyone in your organization then that can access the tool can use it to generate names. Now, they can't change the configuration unless they know that admin login, but they can use it, of course, to generate the names, which is exactly what we want. Now, the Azure Naming Tool, it used to be a standalone tool, but it now actually lives under the Cloud Adoption Framework, and it's part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. So here in a moment, when we go over to GitHub, you'll see that it lives in the Cloud Adoption Framework GitHub repository. So the Azure Naming Tool is a .NET 6 Blazor application with a full REST API, and it runs as a Docker image. So basically, anywhere that you can run a Docker image, you can run the Azure Naming Tool. With that said, because it is just a .NET 6 application, you can also deploy it just straight to an Azure web app if you want to host it up there. Or if you want to host it on-prem or somewhere else, you can just run it as a standalone site wherever you can run a .NET 6 standalone site. And it does use local JSON files to store the configuration. So I'll show you a little bit about this, but there is also an article that I'm going to show you that is a deep dive into the naming tool, and it goes through the specifics here of the JSON configuration files. But effectively, all of the settings in the configuration, there's a default set of JSON files that are used when we deploy the tool, but then there's a subdirectory for where those JSON files are copied to, and when we make configuration changes, those are saved into the subdirectory, which is called settings. So those are the files that we really want to back up and make sure that we've got a copy of in case we need to reinstall the tool or move it somewhere else. So the last slide here, what does this process actually look like? Well, from a high level, we're going to start with deploying the tool. And like I said, I'm going to do that just in Docker Desktop here, but you can do it anywhere a Docker container can run, or an Azure web app, or an IRS website, or wherever you like. I'll then go through the process of showing you how you can start to configure it to meet the naming requirements for your organization. And then from there, users would then be able to leverage the tool to generate names in a consistent and approved format. And I'll show you how, from a user perspective, we can use the tool to generate names. So with that said, let's jump into the demo environment and we'll get started with getting hands-on with the Azure Naming Tool. So the first thing that I want to show you is the GitHub repository where this resides, and that is here in the Cloud Adoption Framework. And by the way, all of the links that I'm going to show you and some other resources will be down below in the description as well. So just expand that out to get these URLs. But you can see here in the Cloud Adoption Framework public repository, there's a directory under /ready/AZ naming tool. And this is where the Azure Naming Tool lives. And there's a lot of great documentation within this repository as well. But what we're going to do is go back to the root repository here. And then on code, I'm going to copy the HTTPS URL because I want to clone this repository down to my machine. So in here, I'm just going to do a git clone and paste that URL in. And that's going to start to pull down that Cloud Adoption Framework repository onto my local machine. Okay, that's finished cloning down to my machine. So what I want to do now is change directory into Cloud Adoption Framework /ready/AZ naming tool so that we're in the directory where the Azure Naming Tool lives, because there are other things in this Cloud Adoption Framework repository as well. So what I want to do from there is a Docker build, and I'm going to copy this in so you don't see all my typos. So there it is wrapped around, sorry, but we've got Docker build /t Azure Naming Tool, and then just a period, which means build from this local folder that I'm in, or the local directory. Now, if I just go back here into the GitHub repository and down into ready and then the AZ naming tool, you'll see there is indeed a Docker file here in this repository, and that's got everything that we need to go and build a Docker image for the Azure naming tool. So that's why I cloned this repository down. So let's go and kick that off, and that is going to go through the Docker build process to get us an image that we can run the container from. Okay, that image is built and that looks good. So let me clear the screen. And actually what I'm going to do is just jump across here into Docker Desktop, and under images, you'll see here that we do indeed have the Azure Naming Tool, and that was created less than a minute ago. From there, I could just click on run it and it would spin it up, or we've got a few other things we can do with the image. But if I jump back here to the command line and let me copy in another one. So this one is going to do a Docker run, and I'm going to map port 8080 on my host machine to port 80 within the container. And then we're going to mount a volume as well, because we do need a persistent volume for where to store that /app/settings directory that I spoke about. So in /app/settings, that is going to be the JSON files that holds our specific configuration. So we want that to be on persistent storage. And then lastly, I've got the name of the Docker image there, which is Azure Naming Tool, and just using the latest tag. So let's go ahead and spin that up, and I'll allow that through my Windows firewall. That's all well and good. And then if we just do a Docker PS, we can see that the container is indeed running there, and it's been running from 9 seconds ago. And over here in Docker Desktop, if we look at containers, we can see that we've got our container running there as well. So that is looking fantastic. With that said, let me just click on the port here, and that will go ahead and launch it in the browser. So this is the Azure Naming Tool. And the first thing that we need to do is just set a password. So I'll just set a default password there and save that. And now we are in here looking at the Azure Naming Tool. So let's go through all of the sections of how we configure and use the tool. So to start with, up the top right there is a toggle for light and dark mode if that's your thing. Here on the home screen is just some information about the tool and some links off and some references. And then let's start here with the admin section on the left-hand side. So as per the name, these are a few administrative things that we can do with the naming tool. So we can see the current version there. If we wanted to change the password, we can do that. We've got an API key, which we'll come back to a bit later on. We can clear the cache. Now, by default, it doesn't allow you to generate duplicate names for resources. So if I went and generated a name for a storage account using a specific location and environment and things like that, and then I tried to regenerate that, it's not going to allow me to do that, because in your organization, if you had many people using this tool, you don't want them generating a name that someone else has already generated and used. But you can toggle that on or off here, and I'll come back and show you that a little bit later on when we get into generating names as well. And then the other thing that the naming tool does is it does reach out to that GitHub repository and check for newer versions of things like all of the resource names that are in Azure and all of the resource locations as well. But you can indeed turn that off so that it doesn't reach out to the internet for that connectivity check. This last bit here is actually brand new in this version that we're looking at today, and I didn't see this in the version when I looked at this tool a couple of weeks ago and started building out this video. So it's for the generation webhook, and as it says here, the naming tool can post generated names to a webhook. So if you've got another downstream system that you want to have a record of, maybe a CMDB of all of the generated names, when someone uses the Azure Naming Tool to generate a name, you can have it then send a webhook down to another system. And you just do that by entering a URL for the webhook in here. And if we have a look at the sample post, this is what's going to be sent to that downstream system. So you're going to get the resource name, you're going to get the resource type, and then it's going to give you all of the components that made up that resource name. And this will make a little bit more sense when we get into the configuration in a few moments. But you can see things here like the resource type is ST for storage. And then we've got things like the environment, which is TST for test, the location, EU2 for East US2, so on and so forth. So that is a handy new feature that has just come into this latest version. That's pretty much all there is in the admin interface. There's also an admin log. So if I go back to admin here, sorry to bounce around, let's just go and change the password, for example. I'll just set it to what it already actually was. If we now go across to the admin log, you'll see here there's an entry that says that the password is updated. So that is a specific log just for the admin tasks of the naming tool. Next up is instructions on the left-hand side, and this is really just a bunch of instructions on how to use the tool. So hopefully this video here is enough, but if you did want to go back and refer to something, definitely have a look at the instructions there because it may be listed there for you. And then the next section down is configuration. And this is where you're going to spend most of your time in the Azure Naming Tool if you're an administrator of the tool and setting up those guardrails and the settings of how the names are going to be generated. Now, interestingly here, we do have a pop-up that's come up telling us that for both resource types and resource locations, that my configuration is out of date. So what that means is that there's some new resource types that have come on board, or there's some new locations, and the team that looks after the cloud adoption framework have gone and updated this information in the GitHub repository. So now my version of the Azure Naming Tool is reaching out and checking if it's got the latest versions of those configurations, which is telling me that I haven't. So it's telling me if I go to types and configuration and then refresh, I can update both the resource types and the resource locations. So park that in the back of your mind for now, and I'll show that to you in just a few moments. So here is the main configuration screen. Now this takes a little while to get used to, but when you do, it will all make sense. So first of all, there's an actions legend up the top. So you'll see these icons here in just a few moments, and they're pretty straightforward. We can move items up or down in an order. We can enable items or disable items. We can edit items or we can delete items. So if you need to refer back to that, please do. But most of those icons are relatively straightforward. Now there's a few different sections here. We've got base configuration, and then we've got component configuration, and then general configuration down the bottom. So let's just walk through top to bottom. Under the base configuration, if I expand out components, a component is something that is going to make up the name of a resource in Azure. Simple as that. And interestingly, if you look at these components here, if we jump back to the Cloud Adoption Framework documentation, there is a table down here that's got all of the components. So you'll see we've got organization. If we go back to the naming tool, we've got organization. Over here, we've got business unit or department. Back in the naming tool, we've got units or departments. So you can see the Azure Naming Tool absolutely aligns specifically to the Cloud Adoption Framework and the guidance that's provided there. So if you've read through the Cloud Adoption Framework information, then these components here in the Azure Naming should make sense to you. Now, by default, these components are listed from top to bottom. These are going to make up our resource names from left to right. So it's going to start on the left-hand side with the resource type. So for a storage account, that might be ST. So that's how the name of our storage accounts is going to start. And it's going to go from left to right or top to bottom here. So if you wanted to, maybe you want the location here at the bottom to actually be at the very start. So by pressing this up arrow here, you can move locations all the way to the top, which means that that component of the name is now going to be on the far left-hand side. Or for example, maybe we want to disable functions from being in the naming component at all, or the base naming component. Or maybe, for instance, if we go ahead and edit that, we might actually want to change the name of it there. Or another thing that you can do for each component is choose to either have it globally optional or globally excluded. So just as an example here, let me close that down. Let's say for locations, for some reason, I didn't want that to appear in my resource names at all. So I could say, no, I want to globally exclude this component from all of my naming, and I can add that in, and that's going to update all resource types. And I'm going to say, yep, go ahead and do that. And there we go. We can see that resource location is now added as an exclusion, but I could also choose to have it optional as well. So by having it as optional, when I go and generate a name, that is then an optional field. So again, I could add that for all resources here and say, yep, for location, I want that to be optional on every single resource. Now, you can modify that on a per resource type, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. I've gone and changed a few things there that I probably didn't want to though. So here under the component, and you'll see this be similar for every other section, there's a configuration section. So you can choose to export just that specific set of information or that configuration. So if I click on export there, let's go and have a look. That is going to be the components configuration only. It's not going to export anything else. And that's going to export it out as JSON. So let's go for a light mode there. And let me just format this so we can see it. And you can see here, this is just specifically the configuration for components. So we've got resource location. Its ID was number 1. Its sort order, where it's going to show up in the order, is number 1. Is it enabled? true or false, and is it custom, true or false. And so these are all of those base components here, just as JSON format, if you did want to export those out. Or you can actually come in here, tweak them as a JSON file, and then back over here in the user interface, you can go ahead and import that back in. But let's go ahead and reset that for now, because I've gone and changed some things that I didn't necessarily want to. And what a reset is going to do, actually, that's a good segue just for a moment. I'm going to go over to Docker Desktop, and on the container, I want to view the files. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but remember down under the app directory, if I scroll down here a little bit, there is a repository folder or a repository directory. And this is where all of those JSON files are stored by default. So you'll see one here for custom components, and there's JSON files here for every section of the naming tool under the repository directory. Now for us, down under settings is where we're storing our version of that. So what happens when you start this container or this app for the first time? It copies the JSON files from the repository directory into the settings directory. And then when we go and make modifications and changes to our version of the application, it goes and writes that down to these JSON files here in the settings directory. So that's why we wanted app/settings to be on a persistent volume, because we want this to persist if the container was to be destroyed and spun back up, or if we do an upgrade, so on and so forth. So just something to keep in the back of your mind whenever you go and reset configuration. For example, right then when I did a reset, all that really did under the hood was copy the JSON file from this repository directory, being the defaults, back into my settings directory, which is where my application is actually looking for all of its current settings. So that is the base configuration components. And then we've got delimiters as well. So by default, it will use a dash for the delimiter. But if you wanted to, maybe you want underscores in your naming standard, so you can enable underscores, but you can only have one delimiter here at a time. I'm going to set mine back to a dash. And then we're down into the component configuration itself. So again, just back here in the base configuration, when we expanded components, we had all of these individual components that we could change the order of. But now we've also got a section down here where we can go further into the configuration of each of those components. So let's have a look at environments. If I scroll down here a little bit, these are all of the environments that are here by default, but this is where I would define all of the environments that my organization uses. So for example, if my organization only has a dev, a test, a UAT, and prod environments, then I might come here and delete these other ones like staging and shared and sandbox, and then just have those four that my organization uses. And maybe I don't use these exact names. Maybe for test, if I edit that one, maybe the short name for that is actually TEST in our organization. So if I update that, we can see that the test environment short name is now called test. And the short names here are important because that is the name that's actually going to appear in our resource name when we generate it. Again, we could go ahead and move these up or down. You can edit it like you just saw then. And if you needed to, you can delete some of these. So let's say we don't need shared. I can go ahead and delete that from the configuration. So that's environments. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these component configurations for you. They're all pretty much the same in terms of what you're doing in here. You're determining, is this important for you? And if so, what configurations do you specifically want? The two that I do want to show you though, the first one is locations. So these are all of the Azure region locations with their name and their short name. Now, what was important here was we got a pop-up a few minutes ago telling us that our locations were out of date. So if I scroll down to the bottom here and go to configuration, for locations, we do have this option here to refresh the resource locations configuration. So by doing a refresh here, the Azure Naming Tool is going to reach out to the GitHub repository, go and get that latest information from out there on what all of the latest regions and their codes are, and then import that into my current configuration. And I didn't see that just then, but there is a tick box there actually to refresh the short names too. And as it says, this will reset your location short names to match the latest Azure Naming Tool values. So if I said okay to that and do a refresh, that's going to go out and pull that information in as well. Again, I could do a reset down there. I could choose to import the configuration from a JSON file, so on and so forth. Now that is also similar. if we go down to resource types here in the component configuration, I need to scroll down all the way to the bottom because these are all of the resources that exist in Azure and therefore the Azure Naming Tool. But similarly down under configuration, I can go and do a refresh to go and pull that information from GitHub into the tool as well. Now, one other thing, I do want to show you here specifically for resources was you might remember a few minutes ago, sorry, I'm just trying to find the top again. You might remember a few minutes ago back up here under the base configuration, when I edited one of these, we had the option here to globally make something optional or globally exclude something. What that actually does is down under resource types, let's look at API management services here. So that's got a short name of APIM, but you'll see here that we've got optional components and excluded components. So if I go ahead and edit this, we can see that under optional components, locations and units/departments is currently optional for this specific resource. And excluded components, we've got functions, locations, and orgs excluded at this point in time. Now, that is because I went and did that globally before, which made that setting apply to all of the resources in the naming tool. But you can come in here if you had a specific reason to. Let's go back into API management actually. Let's say just for API management, I wanted to make the instance optional, just as an example. Just that one component just for API management. I can come in here and I can update specifically just the API management resource, and that won't affect anything else. So you can see there under the optional column, instance is now optional for API management, but it's not optional for any of the other resources. Now, with that said, I've gone and made a few changes there as well. So I want to do a global reset. So if I come down here to the global configuration, which is the last section here, the first thing we can do is an export, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I want to do a reset to go back to the default configuration at the time of installation. So let me go ahead and do a reset there. Yes, everything is going to be reset, and I want to continue with that. Cool, that looks good. Down here under global configuration, you can also do an export as well. So if I click on export, that is just going to export out a JSON file of all of the configuration of the naming tool. And this is something that is recommended to be done before you do an upgrade of the tool, which we'll speak about a bit later on. So if I go ahead and open this file, you can see it is quite large. Let's format that as it is JSON. And it's literally just a JSON document of all of the different configuration of the naming tool as it stands right now. So as I scroll down here, you can see there are many thousands of lines. And down the bottom, we've got some of the information about the administration configuration. Actually, you can see some of those things are null, like the admin password and the API key, because back over here in the tool, there was a checkbox as to whether to include that admin configuration or not. And I chose not to at this point in time. Now, what you can do if something goes wrong or you need to reset the tool, but you want to reset it with your configuration, as long as you've gone ahead and done that export here and gotten this large global configuration JSON file, you can pretty much just copy that, paste it in here, and then do an import. And that is going to import all of your specific configuration for the Azure Naming Tool back into here. So super important that you do go ahead and make an export of it on a regular basis, especially before doing updates. So with that said, I think, let me just collapse these down. I think that's pretty much everything under the configuration section. And that's interesting that it couldn't verify internet connectivity. Let me just dismiss that for now. I don't think that's too important, but that is everything under configuration. So like I said, that is probably where you as an administrator will spend most of your time, is just tweaking this to get it right for your environment and your specific situation, because this is going to be different for everyone, how you want your naming to be structured, what components are optional, what components are excluded, so on and so forth. Now, when you've got that all set up, I'm just going to use the default configuration for now. The next section here is a reference section. And as per the name, this is simply just a reference based off the naming standard and the configuration that you've gone and set. You can come in here and see how a name would be generated for a specific resource. So let's scroll down here. Let's have a look here at API Management Service. So the example that it's giving us is APIM-SPA-dev-AC-1. And then down there under the components, we can see what components it has used in what order to go and build out that example name. So we've got the type, the project, the environment, the location, and the instance, which have all been used from left to right or top to bottom as we saw it in the configuration screen to go and build out that resource name. And then a little bit further down there, we've got the naming guidelines. So these are some of the restrictions and the scope that the naming tool needs to follow to go and name this specific resource. So we can see that it's got some optional components, some excluded components based on the configuration that we've got. It's got the short name for the resource, and then the length here. So an API management service can be 1 to 50 characters long. And then it tells us what are the valid characters for API management. Well, we can have alphanumerics and hyphens, needs to start with a letter and end with alphanumeric. And then it's got a regex there and shows us exactly how it's going to generate the name for that particular resource. So if we go and have a look at something that we know is limited, let's look at storage accounts. This could be fun to try and find. We've got storage. Here we go. We've got storage accounts. So if I scroll down to some of the naming guidelines here, we can see the length for a storage account is 3 to 24 characters. The only valid characters are lowercase letters and numbers, and therefore the regex for this one looks a lot different to API management. So this is hopefully starting to drive home the benefit of this tool. You no longer need to worry about what's supported in a name and what components can you have and how long should it be, and getting your deployment done and then having it fail at the last minute because the name is too long or too short or something like that. If you use the Azure Naming Tool here to generate all of the names, you know that it's going to align with what is actually allowed in the Azure platform. So that is the reference section. So that's simply somewhere to come to reference and have a look based on how you've put the components and the configuration together, what some of the naming would actually look like. So next up, let's go and finally actually generate a name using the tool, and that is done under the generate section here. So if I scroll down, we've got some instructions. So we need to select the desired resource type, we need to review the naming guidelines, we need to select the component options, and then click on generate. So let's go and do this. The first thing that we have here is the generate mode. So when generating a name, we can generate a single resource type name, or we can generate multiple. So let's start with single for now, but we'll come back and have a look at multiple in just a moment. So down here under the desired resource type, let's go with an automation account. So we want to do automation, and the actual resource type is an automation account. And let me scroll down a little bit. So we can see what the naming guidelines are here if we're interested. It's got to be 6 to 50 characters, alphanumerics and hyphens, all good. So now we've got the components that we set up in the configuration section of the naming tool. We can see here that the unit or the department is indeed optional. So I'm going to leave that and not actually select it. Down under the project here, we had a default project just called SPA. For the environment, let's say this is for the dev environment. That's all well and good. And location, this will be close to home. Let's go with Australia East. And the instance is a number. So for me, that might be 001. So we've gone and selected our individual components here of what we want in this resource name. And then down the bottom, I can simply click on generate. And we'll see there that we've got the resource type. So we can see that it is an automation account. And there's the generated name, AA-SPA-dev-AE-001. So from there, I could, of course, just select that and copy it. Or if I wanted to, I can export the generated name. Now, this is interesting because I don't think that this tool should have actually come up with that red box there, which now says failure. That has gone and exported the name for me here in a CSV file. If I open that up and need to zoom in a bit there. Appearance, I've forgotten the control plus and equals. There we go. So we can see this CSV file that I exported, it does only have one resource in it, but the resource type is an automation account and the generated name is listed there. So this can be handy if we're generating a lot of names, which I'll show you in just a moment. But just to come back to the tool, I think that this was a bit of a bug, so I'm actually going to log this on the GitHub repository. I think what it tried to do behind the scenes there was actually regenerate the name when I clicked on that export generated names button, where it should have just exported them and not regenerated it. And because of that setting that I showed you earlier about not allowing duplicate names, it's coming up here and telling me that the resource name was not generated because it already exists and it's already been generated by the tool. Now, if I was to go and show the components here again, and we made this instance 002, I can go ahead and generate that one and it works just fine. But if I went back and tried to generate 001 again, it's going to give me that failure because we're not allowing the duplicate names to be generated by the tool. So with that said, let me scroll back up and let's flick across. Actually, before I do, I want to show you the generated names log. So this, kind of similar to the admin log, is just a log file showing us all of the names that have been generated. So down here, we can see that we've generated 2 names so far. We've got 001 and 002 for the Azure automation account. We can see when they were created and all of the inputs for the components that we used to make up that generated name. Now you can come in here, and if you were allowing duplicate names, then you can purge the log here. But because we're not allowing duplicate names to be generated, this log file, I believe, is needed by the tool so that it knows what names have actually been generated and therefore whether it's going to allow you to generate a name based on whether it's already been generated in the log or not. So if we go back to the generate section, let's just scroll down here, and this time we're going to generate multiple resource names. And as soon as I tick that box, it comes up here with this pop-up window to select the resource types that I want to generate. And you can use this filter box at the top as well. So let's say this time I want to do a storage account. So I'll tick that one there. And maybe I want to do a Redis cache. Redis, there we go. And let's also do a service. I told you I shouldn't type. Let's do a service bus as well. So I'll tick those 3 and then just close that window. And you can see now that the resource types that I've got is a storage account, a Redis cache, and a service bus namespace. Now, if I go down here, if I wanted to, by the way, I could click on that select button and select or deselect one of those that I've already gotten. So let's say I forgot something like API management. I can select that, add it back in, and you'll see it gets added to the list there. So let's go through. Now, one thing to note when you're generating multiple resource names, as it says here in red, all components will be required. And I think that's because it can't do validation in real time here for multiple resource types if you've got specific settings on different resource types. So it's going to ask you for all of the components, assuming that you need them all. So let's go ahead and we'll select our organization name. We'll select our department or our unit name, our project name, the default function name. So by the way, these are all things that you can configure, by the way. And then under environments, let's say this is for the production environment. And again, we're going to go with Australia East. And all of these is going to also be 001 in terms of their names. So I'll go ahead and click generate there. And look at that. Simple as that. We've got our 4 resources there with all of their generated names. And I've now got those that I can use in however I'm deploying those resources. Infrastructure as code, variable files, in the portal using ClickOps, so on and so forth. The other interesting thing there is that it does have a notes section. So you can see for storage accounts, it's saying that the specified delimiter, which in my case was a hyphen, is not allowed for this resource type and has been removed. So you can see there why it doesn't have any dashes in it, and it gives us exactly the reason why. So that is how to generate multiple names using the Azure Naming Tool as well. And again, if we go over here to the generated names log, we'll see all of those 4 resources that we just generated there in the log. So if we now went and tried to regenerate those, we're not going to be allowed to because of that duplicate items check. Just to remind you, I've referenced that a few times. Back over here in admin, if I scroll down, this is the option here. Do we want to allow duplicate names or not? And if you toggle this across to enable, you are allowing duplicate names. So I could now go back into the generate section and generate one of the names that has already been generated by the tool. One thing I want to do here is I'm just going to grab the URL of localhost and let's go ahead and open up a new private window. So I want you to assume now that we are no longer the administrator and maybe we are someone who just needs to consume the tool because I'm deploying a new resource in Azure and I need to know what the name should be. So this is kind of more so from the user perspective. I would browse across to the tool. And by the way, you can of course have your custom domain names and things like that route to the tool wherever you're hosting it. And because I'm not logged in here, if I went to the admin section, it's going to ask me for the password. And if I went to the configuration section, let me expand out those components. You'll notice I don't have any of the admin tools to actually go and modify this configuration. I can view the configuration, but I can't go and change anything unless I log into the admin section there. But the main thing of interest for me will be to go to the generate section as an end user and do exactly what we just did. I'm not going to show it to you again because we just went through it, but I could now go and generate a name for any resource in Azure that is here in the naming tool, get the name that I need, and then go on with my deployment. So from there, that is using the user interface to generate the name. But like I mentioned, there is of course an API as well. So here under the admin section, there is an API key, and I'm just going to copy that to my clipboard for now. And if we go back to the home screen, I think there's a link from here. Yeah, there is. So for guidance on using the API, review the Swagger page. So I'm going to open that up in a new tab. And over here, if you're not familiar with Swagger, it's effectively some documentation for all of the API functions that you can use for a particular service. And it's really cool. You can even use it and execute the APIs from here, which I'll show you in just a moment. So these are broken down in all of the different sections. So we've got the API for admin, custom components, importing and exporting. So if you wanted to automate the if you wanted to automate the export of the configuration of a regular basis, you can absolutely do that using the REST API. Like I said at the start, all of the functions in the tool are driven by the API. So you can do anything with the tool using the API. But let me go down here and let's just have a look. There's a GET request here for the resource delimiters. So let's expand that out. And we need to provide I need to click on this try it out button here in the right-hand side, which allows me to execute this API call directly here from the Swagger interface. So if I paste in the API key there, we do have an option here, or a parameter rather, on whether to, what's that for? That is for the admin. I don't think we need that specifically for this one. So let's go ahead and we'll execute that. And then down here, it's going and showing me what curl I could run to go and use this specific API. It's showing me the request URL, and it's actually gone and ran that here. So we can see we got a 200 response, which is good. And here in the response body, we get back what the delimiter actually currently is. So it's currently using the dash delimiter, it's enabled, its ID is 1, and its sort order is currently 1. So you can use this to go ahead and get information or set information. The one thing that I did want to show you though, is if I just do a find, I want to look for resource naming requests. So we can send a resource naming request over the API to the Azure Naming Tool. So let me expand out the request name here and click on the try it out button. I'm going to paste in the API key, and you can see with this one that we need to send in a request body to this specific API. So we need to send in a JSON payload, which is going to have all of that component configuration. Remember here, if I just bounce back to the user interface and go to generate, remember if we wanted to generate a specific resource name, we needed to provide the information for all of these components, whether they're optional or whether they're not. We need to provide some information here before we can go ahead and generate the name. So it's the same deal here, of course, with the API. So with this one, I do have a request body over here on the left-hand side. And this is going to go ahead and generate a Redis cache name. So I've got the resource type set to Redis. I've got the project set to SPA. Location is Australia Central or AC. It's 001 and it's for my prod environment. So if I go ahead and execute that and scroll down, you'll see here I've got a response body. The success is set to true. And then the resource name, the value there is indeed our resource name. It is Redis-SPA-PRD-AC-001. So it's used the information that we've passed in here in this JSON body, along with the configuration of the naming tool and what my organization guardrails and processes are, to then deliver me back the name of the resource. So if I want to do something programmatically here with the Azure Naming Tool, you can absolutely do that as well to generate those names. And indeed, if we go back over here to the generated names log, just for argument's sake, we can see right there at the top that the Redis cache that I just generated using the API is indeed there in the generated names log as well. So if I jump back to the Swagger UI and I just want to show you, I'm going to remove the resource type here from this payload. I think you can expect this, but I'm going to execute that. And if I scroll down here, this time we get a 400 response back, which is expected. And it's saying here that the error is for the resource type. The resource type field is required. Let me zoom in on that a little bit just so you can see it. There it is there, saying that the resource type field is required. And of course, we didn't provide it. So you will get some really helpful information back if you're not passing in the correct information to the specific API. So with that said, I think that's pretty much everything covered off for the naming tool at a reasonably high level. Like I said, you'll spend most of your time here in this configuration section just tweaking this and getting this right. But once you've got it right for your organization and how you do naming within your organization and your company, this will be a really nice resource to use to quickly go and generate names. The last thing that I did want to show is I've got a URL here, which links back out to GitHub on updating the tool. So there's some instructions here in updating.md, again, links down below, that will talk you through how to go and update the tool, because the Cloud Adoption Framework team do, of course, release updates to the tool itself, and you will want to know how to update the tool. At a really high level, it's basically make sure that you've done a global backup of all of that configuration, like I showed you, out to a JSON file stored somewhere else. And then it's just doing an update of the application. So it depends on how you've deployed it. If you've deployed it as a container, then you just need to build a new image based off the updates from GitHub and then use that image and replace it for your container. If you're doing something like an Azure web app and you've set up a GitHub action, they've got an example, by the way, here in this repository. If you've gone ahead and done that, then it's just a matter of redeploying the updated application out to that Azure web app using GitHub actions. Or if you're running it as a .NET site somewhere, it's as simple as updating the code base with the newer version of that .NET site. That's all there is to it, really. I just wanted to point out specifically there is an article here on how to update, and it talks you through a bit of step-by-step here for those 3 specific use cases. Now, it does actually mention on all of these updates down the bottom here, if the Docker volume was not modified, for example, all of the existing settings should be retained, but it does specifically state as the first step each time to make sure that you've done a backup. And if you need to do a restore, it's got the instructions here on how to do a restoration using that JSON configuration file that was generated by doing the backup. And with that said, I've just seen one other tab that I've got here that I just want to point your attention to. This was written by the person who looks after the Azure Naming Tool. I've actually forgotten his name. I can't believe that. Let me go here to the Azure Naming Tool. Bryan. So sorry, Bryan, if you end up watching this, but Bryan is fantastic, and he's basically the maintainer or maybe the developer, certainly doing a lot of work with the naming tool. Any issues that gets logged, Bryan is straight onto it. But there is a blog post here by Bryan, which is probably worth a read if you want to do a bit of a deeper dive. And where this gets really interesting is he goes through the architecture of what's actually going on. But as I scroll down, he's got some information here on those JSON configuration files that I spoke about and the kind of process that it goes through. You know, like I said, the site launches. Does the settings folder exist? If it doesn't, then we'll go ahead and create it. If it does, then we'll go into that repository directory and then copy out all of the JSON files from repository to settings. So this article here gives you a really good deeper dive into what's going on behind the scenes for the application itself of the Azure Naming Tool. So again, I'll link that down below as some follow-up reading for you to do after this video. But with that said, I really hope that's been useful for you. I hope the Azure Naming Tool is something that you didn't know about and now you do know about, and you can go ahead and download it. Easiest way to get started is probably just using Docker Desktop, have a play around with it locally on your machine. And if it's something that you see your organization using, go ahead and launch it into your organization, host it somewhere as a Docker container or up in Azure as a web app, and start communicating around and letting your teams use the Azure Naming Tool to make sure that all of the resources within your Azure environment are being generated with the naming restrictions and constraints and the guardrails that you've gone and put in place. So with that, thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far, thank you very much. I hope that's been valuable, and I'll see you again in the next one.